4. So 4 in the morning. I'm not sure which is later, 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning for it. Now, I've heard some of you might be seeing my video freezing a little bit. I think for some of you, it's okay. For some of you, it might not be working. Whilst I'm sure you all want to see my face, as long as you can hear me, that's the main thing for it. So, because we're starting just a little bit late, I'm going to get straight into the session now for it and just get going with things. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me all over the world. We've got lots and lots of different people here. My name's David Stevenson, and I'm the Senior Professional Development Manager in Oxford University Press, mainland China. So I'm speaking to you from Beijing today. I've seen we've got a few other people from Asia, someone from Japan as well. Great to see for it. But I think most of you seem to be from Europe. Now, this session that I'm going to be speaking about today is flipped teaching with primary students. We're going to be talking about flipped teaching and blended teaching, moving your face-to-face classes and your online classes together. And we've got this tagline, it's not just more homework. So really looking at what we can do. Before I get started, there's a couple of things that I'd like to point out. Number one, I'm not going to be talking in detail about platforms and systems you can use. I'm going to assume most of you already have a platform that you are able to use. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of get straight on with things, and I'll show you the agenda, what we're going to be talking about. So we've got what is blended learning. We're going to talk about the benefits of synchronous. So for our context, that's going to be face-to-face teaching in the classroom, and asynchronous learning. So teaching people online when they can learn at any point. And then we'll be looking at flipped learning, kinds of activities that we can do, and then how we can link our online and offline classes. Now, the reason we're going to be talking about this with you is, I think, for nearly everyone in the world, we all started off in January this year in our lovely world of teaching face-to-face. Everything was happy how we knew it. And then for us here in China and different points throughout the world, we all got moved into online teaching, and it was suddenly no face-to-face classes, just everything online. Now, just to make a third way of teaching for us, many of us are now moving into a kind of a blended context where we are teaching both face-to-face for some of our classes, and some of the learning and classes is happening online. So this is not going to be a deep dive into things. It's just going to be an introduction to kind of help you get started with how you can manage that new teaching context with your students. So we're going to be looking, as the title mentioned, about primary students. And I kind of wanted to start off with this quote from Nikki Hockley. And I think it's a really important one for us to remember when we're doing online teaching or anything involving technology with young learners. For young learners or primary school students, their experiences vary widely. If you've got a 6-year-old student, kind of in grade 1, their ability and experience is going to be very, very different to someone who is 10 years old for it. So again, hugely different, even within this group of young learners. So as I'm kind of talking about things today, I'm going to be trying to shoot for the middle age group in between. But do bear in mind, if you're working with grade 1 or 6-year-old students, you might need to make things a little bit simpler or think about what they can do with a computer if they're 6 years old. Again, 10-year-olds might be able to do something a little bit more different for it. So keep that in the back of your mind, and hopefully if you've got specific questions about the different age groups, feel free to type them in. And when we get towards the end of the session, we'll be able to look at it in a bit more detail there. But before we kind of get into things, I'm going to kind of look at the differences and the benefits of synchronous and asynchronous learning. So as I mentioned earlier, synchronous learning is, in our context, face-to-face teaching. What we do when we have the students in the classroom. It could also be like webinars, but we're going to be focusing on that face-to-face side of things. Asynchronous is usually done on a computer, but if you're working with 6-year-olds or younger primary students, you might have them doing something on pen and paper. But the important part of asynchronous is it's something they do independently on their own for it. Everyone working at different times. You set the task, but maybe some of them will do it at 6 o'clock in the morning, maybe some of them will do it at 10 o'clock, maybe some of them will do it Monday or Tuesday. What I'm going to show you is some benefits. I'd like to keep things positive and not focus on the negatives or the challenges. And all I'd like you to do is try to match them. Do you think this is a key benefit of synchronous face-to-face learning, or do you think it's a key benefit of asynchronous learning? So all you need to do is write down 1, ABCD, 2, BCG, whatever you think they are. So you should be able to see lots of different colours. I'm going to start my timer, and I'm only going to give you, because I started a little bit late, I'm going to give you 1 minute to start kind of typing these into the chat box. There's no right or wrong answer for this. It's just your thoughts. Your 1 minute starts now. What is it, AG1 CD? Okay, lots of people saying C coming through. C is a benefit of synchronous. Fantastic. F, immediate feedback is cropping up quite a lot. What have we got? I'm going to look for some 2s when I can see them. Another 30 seconds here. B, yeah, fantastic. Glad to see B coming up. Quite a lot for asynchronous. The one I'm always interested to see is E, less pressure. Where do people put that? Lots of 2s coming up for it. Some people putting it as 1s. Fantastic. I'm going to give you another just 5 seconds before I show my answers. Keep thinking about it. Don't worry too much. Okay, and fantastic. We've got a wide variety, but some kind of common themes. I think most of you are agreeing with my kind of key answers that I've got here. So I'm just going to show you mine now for it. I think it's most of you, I think nearly everyone was kind of pointing this out. The key part of synchronous or face-to-face learning is that support and interaction for it. Students, when they're learning in the classroom and they can see other people, it's much easier for them to get support from their peers. Being able to offer the answers, give each other feedback, even just encouragement can definitely apply there. Social interaction, and I think this is one of the key parts, especially when we're talking about young learners, is if they're learning asynchronously, it's very difficult for them to get social support and social interaction. You can set it up with adults, but for young learners, being face-to-face is much easier for them to get that support. This is why one of the key things that people were talked about when everyone moved to asynchronous or independent learning was, how do we support students emotionally? How do we make sure they're doing that? And then F for me is one of the key parts, which is immediate feedback. This feedback can become from the teacher as kind of like error correction, but it also comes from things like, just the face of the teacher. If a student makes a joke, being able to see a smile, being able to see a thumbs up, being able to hear people laugh, is something that you can only really get from synchronous learning. Asynchronous learning for it, though. The key part that we get here is time for the students. What happens is the students are allowed to study a little bit more at their own pace and have some more time. Even in the most differentiated of classrooms, where we put different streams and people are doing group work, there's always a little bit more pressure that we can kind of get them feeling. Whereas being able to kind of open your book, review the work as you want, I think is a really nice thing that you can get from asynchronous. There's less pressure, which I think is really important, and it was nice to see some of you putting that there. I think it's really easy to forget. If you kind of get those lists of people's greatest fears, or what do they not like, I think it always kind of goes sort of like, being attacked by a lion, drowning, and then number one, everyone's greatest fear is speaking in public for it. But even those people who are petrified in speaking in front of an audience of 30 people, they're quite happy to type on Twitter for it. When you're working online and you're kind of sharing things, there is less pressure. Lots of you typing your answers and questions. I'm sure you'd feel a lot more nervous if you were doing it standing up in front of 400 different people. The final one, which is the focus on autonomy. Now, this is a really important one for us. And I don't mean just getting the students to learn asynchronously means they will become more independent. It makes the teacher think about it a little bit more. If we want primary students to be working independently, we need to think, how are we going to plan our activities? How are we going to scaffold the students to do it? So one of the things I do like about asynchronous learning is it forces us as a teacher to think about it. Now, I saw someone in the comments kind of mentioned, all the advantages of synchronous learning, like support from peers. You can get those from, my PPT's just disappeared. You can get those from asynchronous learning as well, which I think is something that you can do. But it's important to remember that when we've got students who are primary aged, getting peer support is much, much easier for them to get if they are in the face-to-face classroom and working together. My PPT's just come back, so hopefully you can see it there. Now, again, just in the interests of time, I'd like you to kind of keep these advantages in the back of your mind as we go through these different sessions and these different ideas, because focusing on the advantages of asynchronous and focusing on the advantages of synchronous is something that's really important for us to do. So as is mentioned, we're going to be looking at blended learning. Now, blended learning is when we take synchronous and asynchronous learning and we put them together, so both online and offline work for the students. Now, there's lots of different ways that we can do this. Gordon Lewis in Learning Technology, he pointed out as the most simple one that we can do is book practice with some online practice, which uses a learning management system. So this is how we'd get the students to be able to, you do the normal work in the classroom, but then the students, when they go home, maybe they complete some activities online. Maybe there's some little games for them to play. But the important bit is, as a teacher, we can see what score they got. So this is probably the most simple form of blended learning. The other one that we have is what we kind of call basic blended. And this is when online replaces some of the classroom instruction as well. So maybe rather than just doing practice activities, the students are doing things like watching a video at home and writing down the key words for it. Maybe they've got some extra listening that they're doing that is going to introduce some of the key words that we're going to get later. But it's a nice, simple way of us kind of carrying on doing what we normally do in the face-to-face classroom, but adding a little bit extra. So what we end up with is something that maybe looks like this. And this is a very, very simple outline of a reading lesson, a very simplified outline. So what happens is we divide it into two sections. In the first part, this blue one, this is what normally happens in our face-to-face classroom. We introduce key language, we help the students understand it by doing some vocabulary activities, the students then read, we check their understanding, and the students complete an integrated skills activity. So something where maybe they're talking about what they read. Maybe they start planning a rating based around what they read. Then the students, for homework, they go home and they do something on their computer, more practice activities based around it. This is a perfectly fine way of doing it, but I think one of the dangers that can happen when you first start moving to blended learning or flipped learning is you kind of think about the online work just being more homework. That's all they're kind of getting there. And that's not taking advantage of the key things that we can do with online learning or face-to-face teaching. So flipped teaching is where we really focus on the key advantages. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is I'm going to show you lots of very, very common things that I think we do in the face-to-face classroom. And I'd like you to remember and think back to those advantages that we spoke about and say, do you think these really help the benefits of face-to-face synchronous learning, or do these hold the benefits of asynchronous learning? Now, I know you can do both of them either way, but think about which is their key advantage. So if we can look on this slide here, down the bottom you can see role plays. So role plays for me are definitely something that has the strengths of synchronous face-to-face learning. If you're working with primary students, this is very, very difficult to do online asynchronously. So to give me a chance to drink some coffee, I'm going to give you 1 minute now. Just pick 2 or 3 of these common classroom things and think, do these lean to the strengths of asynchronous delivery, or do these lean to the strengths of face-to-face teaching? As I say, I'll just give you 1 minute. I'll set my timer now, and I'm going to drink a little bit of coffee. Type away into the chat box. Shared reading responses, wikis online, fantastic. Collaborative response for synchronous, for collaborative work. Yeah, I'd agree with that one, collaborative. Asynchronous, independent reading, fantastic, thank you. I apologise. Marana, I think that'll definitely work there. Synchronous number 9, shared reading responses. Collaborative project work, again, wikis, fantastic. Role plays, synchronous, thank you for the pink rating as well. I'm going to give you just another 30 seconds for this. face-to-face role plays, shared reading, project collaborative, fantastic. YY, introducing vocabulary. Okay, fantastic. A couple there. Can give you just 10 more seconds. I'm going to do counting down in Chinese here for those of you who can see the webcam. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, fantastic. Now, do keep your answers kind of coming in here for it. But I'm going to kind of go through some of mine, just not all of them, but just some of them for it that I think are kind of key for us to look at. So if we think about introducing a vocabulary, often when we're kind of introducing vocabulary, one of the key parts is kind of showing the meaning of that vocabulary and then giving students time to practice it and giving students time to remember it. You can definitely do it in a kind of collaborative way with the students, but I think there definitely needs to be some time that is independent. Students will maybe be working at different speeds with this vocabulary. So for me, introducing vocabulary is something that works quite well with asynchronous. The same as research stages of project work. The students are kind of researching, definitely as Marana has just said, asynchronous works quite well for this because it's quite independent. They need to take their time. It links very much to that independent reading. But the collaborative project work stages, this is something that's much easier to set up with students working when they can see each other, working synchronously. Now, lots of you have said you can do it both, and it is true. You can definitely do collaborative project work asynchronously, but I think that's much easier to do online, with older students online. If you're working with primary students, you'd probably want them doing that in a synchronous way. Planning written work is something that I would probably be getting the students to do for me synchronously. If I'm working with low-level primary students, I think this is one of the key parts where they'll need that support. Even if they're just writing a description of their family for it, then I think getting the students to be able to draw a picture, have that moment when they talk to their partner, really helps set up the writing work, which they can then do independently and asynchronously, drafting and editing it. Same as shared reading responses. Now, I can't remember who it was, mentioned using wikis, and I think they're fantastic, but that's where you must really remember the age of your students. If you're working with young primary students, getting them set up on a wiki is probably quite complicated to do. So for their synchronous, as they move on to the older students, then that's something that we can get them working on for it. Lots of different ways. So we're kind of looking at a general approach. And do remember, it will vary a little bit for you. So coming on to this idea of kind of basic blended, this is where we can start having the students doing some classroom instruction for it. But we can also start looking at this, which is actually the fourth way, the third that I'm introducing, of getting the students to have a flipped classroom. Now, I've got a kind of key things to say here, which is the role of the teacher and student change for it. Now, I don't mean they swap around. I'm not saying the teacher becomes the student and the students become the teacher for it. That's not what I mean. What happens here is what we're focusing on doing changes quite a bit. Learner autonomy becomes something that's really crucial for the students to do. Now, rather than me just talking about this, I'm going to kind of show you an example of how we can do that in the classroom and how this would work with asynchronous and synchronous learning. So here again is our kind of basic outline that we might have of a very, very simple lesson outline. And if we are looking at a flipped teaching approach, what instead happens is that we have the asynchronous content is this kind of thing, where we're introducing the language, where we're having help for the students to understand, and the reading, and the students completing practice exercises. This has been done asynchronously. And really important here, this happens before the synchronous classroom. And this is what I meant by the role of the teacher kind of changes for it. Our face-to-face classroom becomes much, much more about getting the students to practice that language. Remember, we're talking about primary-aged students. So what we want to get them doing is that kind of working together, having any kind of interaction for it is much easier to do in a face-to-face classroom rather than trying to set that up asynchronously. So that's what we'll be kind of looking at. Don't worry if you're not 100% with me. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes going through this in a lot more detail for it. So the key kind of thing for us to remember here is the asynchronous part in the flipped classroom happens before the synchronous classroom. Here, we're introducing vocabulary. Here, we're introducing new grammatical forms or new structures, and we're introducing things like standardized forms. So say, for example, you're focusing on rating. This is where you would introduce to the students the layout of a newspaper, for example, things that are very, very standardized. You get the students looking at that before the class. So we make sure before they come to the classroom, they've got a basic understanding. There's a much bigger focus when we're looking at primary, usually, on the input. And then the synchronous part of it is where we focus on practical activities, engaging activities, interactive activities, anything, the kind of collaborative learning or communication focused aspects. Lots of these should be happening in the synchronous classroom when we're face to face and focusing on applying. Now, I think as language teachers, we have a really big advantage here in that for language teaching, we're used to doing practical, engaging, interactive activities. Most of us have been doing communicative language teaching for a long time. So we're able to see that being done with the students. If you're a science teacher, this can be much more challenging to implement. So I do think we have a big advantage of the students. So what we're going to go through now is we're going to go through some examples of how we would set this up in the language classroom. And we're going to see, I'm going to focus, as I mentioned, I think as language teachers, we're usually quite good at engaging activities, interactive activities. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on this orange box and what kinds of asynchronous before the class kinds of activities can we do. I've got a few kind of quick guidelines before I go into the activities that I'll show you, things for you to remember. When you're getting students to do activities, it's really important that you keep everything short for the students. Don't give them too much to do beforehand. If you read about anything to do with flipped teaching, it's really important that you don't make them watch a whole lecture, a 30-minute explanation of you talking. Make sure everything's short games, very, very quick for them to do. If you're introducing vocabulary, don't give them 20 words to learn independently. break it down so they're just focusing, if they're young students, on 6 words that they're learning independently. Linked to that, and I've seen lots of you kind of pointing this out, is keep it interesting. Provide tasks for the students to do. Again, if you look at online things about flipped teaching, lots of them will say, get the students to watch a lecture before they do the interactive activities. And I would say, no, definitely do not do that with your language students. If you've got primary students, do not get them watching a 30-minute lecture. Get them doing lots of short little tasks that guide them through what you're going to do. Use variety and visuals. For the independent asynchronous study, get the students looking at videos that you could record. Get them looking at pictures. Get them doing short activities. And we'll go through lots of those activities in a minute. And then really, really crucial is remember the age of the students. You'll need to have some parent and carer support. If you're working with 6-year-olds, make sure you've thought, what support will they need being able to do things online? What limits with tech use do they have? I can't remember who it was, but I just saw someone mentioning, that some of the students are technophobes for it. Don't worry about that side of it too much. Think about, the asynchronous can be done on a bit of paper that they just take a photo of. So you can keep things nice and simple for that. I'm going to go through now some of the kinds of activities that I've seen the students doing, or I've seen teachers doing, or that I've done myself for the asynchronous part. What can they do independently? And hopefully this will give you an idea of how you can keep it short, how you can keep it interesting, and how we can remember that these students are primary age. They can't do all the complicated activities like Wiki and things that we've mentioned. So I'm going to look at just 2 things in this session, just because it's a very short session. We're going to have a look at introducing and practicing vocabulary. And we're going to have a look at that bit first. And then after that, we're going to have a look at some things that you can do for introducing and practicing grammar online. Please remember the basic principles that we've got, because you can apply them to things like writing, to the skills work that you're going to be looking for. So I'm going to start off really quickly with vocabulary. And if you were teaching vocabulary face-to-face with your students, just very quickly, I'm only going to give 30 seconds for this, type into the chat box, what kinds of activities would you do face-to-face with your students if you were introducing vocabulary? What would be the first thing that you'd maybe do with them? Straight away, we've got someone saying flashcards. So definitely someone kind of working there. Introducing flashcards, fantastic. Word games, face mimic, jigsaws, pictures for it, brainstorming, fantastic. Using realia, a fantastic one there, so very, very similar. Stories, great to hear there for it. Hangman for it. Crosswords for it. Pictionary, a great one. Okay, and toys, dictionaries, cues, rhymes is an interesting one. Comic strips, so again, telling them a story. I'm going to give you just 2 more seconds before I move on. And we're going to go 1 and fantastic. I'm going to stop you there. And it takes a story. It's a wonderful one for us to kind of see. Okay, if we're doing this asynchronously with our students, one of the things that we can start with is using a video. The reason when I'm teaching students asynchronously that I like using a video, especially with primary, is we can use lots of those activities that you've already said for introducing. All you need to do is record yourself on your camera, on your phone, and you can show yourself with the flashcards, introducing them one by one. If you kind of do things like taking them out of a bag, revealing a little bit, saying, can you guess what this is? If you've got 6 years old students, that's how you can do it there for it. Someone mentioned telling them a story. Again, you can tell them a story through using a video. Picture talk, where you show them a picture and you talk them through it. Again, this can be done just by recording yourself. So again, all of your kind of examples here, these are really, really nice ways that we can kind of introduce to the students ways that we can do it asynchronously. So I just read a question there, got distracted. The next part that we kind of most have moved on to, and lots of you kind of started saying this, is getting the students doing puzzles for it. And I think getting the students to do puzzles or little thinking activities is a great way of getting them practicing it online. So I'm going to show a couple of very, very quick activities that you can get the students to do asynchronously. What happens is, someone mentioned earlier that critical thinking asynchronously is quite difficult, and I disagree with that. It's using puzzles is something that we can definitely get the students to do. So, for example, if you are introducing animals, the classic primary topic for vocabulary, and you've introduced elephant, cow, giraffe, lion, tiger, gazelle to them, all you would ask them to do is, once you've introduced it in a video, is ask them to rank it from most to least. So maybe you say, which is the fastest and which is the slowest? And the students make a list that they can then share with everyone. Maybe you say, which is the heaviest, which is the lightest, which is the ugliest, which is the most beautiful. And again, the students just make a list of that vocabulary and they can share it with everyone. A really simple activity that you can do. The same as, oh, I can't find it, any of these kind of topics, you can get the students to introduce this and practice it at home really, really simply. If you're looking at food, just ask the students to rank them from healthiest to unhealthiest, favourite to least favourite. Even if you're doing something like furniture, ask them to do it. What's the heaviest furniture to the lightest furniture? But this is a simple activity that the students can do on their own and get them to share really, really quickly just by taking a photo of it and sharing it with each other. Someone said, countries, be careful what you're doing. Yes, but you know, if you do something simple like, you know, which country is the furthest to the nearest from where you're based, that's something they can do. Really quickly, I'm going to show you a few more kind of activities, just because I don't want to run out of time here. If you're focusing, you can do things like Venn diagrams, if you're doing adjectives with them. So get them to match the adjectives of the jungle or the desert for it. Which ones are just for them, which ones go in the middle for it. We've got here this purple list of food for it. Here, the students read the new vocabulary, the food you're introducing, and they think, what is the name of the category for it? So, for example, this one here is food from an animal. These ones here are food not from an animal. And then we have this red group down the bottom for it. And this is a very, very simple odd one out. So all the students have to do is say which do they think is the odd one out. Is it number 1, 2, or 3? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to kind of type something into the box if you think it's 1, 2, or 3. Which is the odd one out. I could do my little countdown, I thought. We've got a bird as the odd one out. For another bird coming here. Bird seems to be the most popular one. I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to let you know now that my answer was elephant is the odd one out, because you will not see an elephant on the streets of Beijing, where I live, for it. But again, this is using a little bit of critical thinking for the students. Number 3 is just as likely to be an answer, as long as they can kind of justify it a little bit. If they're using, if I can move to the next thing, I'm going to go through quite quickly here because I'm running out of time from starting a bit late. A bird is not a mammal. Good answer for that one. If they're practicing pronunciation, I'm going to come on to some other activities later, but a really simple one that you can kind of do is just getting them to match the words to the words that sound similar for it. So in column 2, sister, health, fat, hair, head, I've got here a list of words that were from earlier units that the students have done. And then this first list, mat, armchair, shelf, bed, mirror, these are words from the new unit that they're learning. So all the students would have to do is match the new words to the old words. Which one sounds similar? So for example, mat, fat for it. Bed, head that they're doing. Mirror, sister is a bit of a half rhyme, and the same as shelf, health is a little bit of a half rhyme for it. But again, it gets the students thinking about pronunciation asynchronously. So the reason I kind of wanted to share this with you is when you're doing asynchronous teaching, the students are learning independently. They don't just have to do the activities that you've got in the workbook. They don't just have to be doing word searches. You can still get them doing some critical thinking activities. So I'm going to move on really quickly. Sorry, I'm running out of time for it. To kind of looking at some activities we can do for grammar asynchronously. And the important bit to remember is just as we kind of went from looking at the context to practicing the vocabulary to working on form for it, we can kind of do the same thing with students and grammar. We can follow what we often do in the class, but get them doing it asynchronously and on their own. So if you're introducing grammar, just the same as lots of you said there for vocabulary, one of the easiest ways to introduce grammar to our students is by starting off with a context for them. Now, you could do you talking, record yourself, and get the students to look at it. Or for something a little bit different, we can get the students doing activities based around a reading, a story for them to do. So I'm going to show you a few activities that you can get your students to do with a story for introducing details in a reading for it. Sorry, apologies again. I kind of just read a question for it. Now, one of my kind of favorite and simple activities you can do, we'll look at something for slightly older students here, is using a story and getting them to focus on the meaning of it. Now, if you're using most Oxford University Press textbooks, this is from American Family and Friends, 2nd edition, they often have a story that introduces the grammar before you teach the grammar. And we can use this asynchronously just as well. So what we get the students doing is just ordering the story. After they've ordered the story and put it in the right way, we can then get the students to just draw a picture, or if they're old enough, write what do they think is going to happen next for it. But the important part here is the students have read about the grammar quite a lot of times. So not read about it, they've read the grammar being used in action. So after they've read about the grammar, what we can get them doing is then focusing a little bit on the meaning of that grammar. So they've had the context, and now we move on to the grammar explanation. This is somewhere that I strongly think that we should be using videos for introducing the grammar. Now, lots of different approaches. They quite often say, don't explicitly explain the grammar, but this is somewhere that I think we should explain the grammar. Now, it's really important that if you have got an explanation of grammar, record it on your phone for it and keep the explanation short, focusing on the meaning. If your explanation is more than 3 minutes long and you're working with primary students, I will tell you now that your video is too long. Your explanation is too long. Only focus on one thing and keep it really, really quick. If you want, say you're teaching, like me, in China, and all of your students speak in Chinese, fantastic. I do think it's okay to use your first language here for them. If you want to be kind of explaining it in Italian, if that's where you are, again, that's your call. But I do think it's okay to do it. I don't think it needs to be overly detailed. If you've got multilingual groups, then obviously try to keep it here. But the reason I say this is maybe something for us to think about with asynchronous learning is the students are working more independently for it. So I think it's quite useful for them to have an explicit explanation. Remember, they're young students for it. We can't expect them to pick up everything on their own. So I'm going to give you a really, really quick example of how you might use an explanation of present perfect. This would be recorded as a video. If I was doing it for my students here in China, I would deliver this in Chinese to them. They'd be able to see my PPT and I'd be speaking in Chinese, but I'm not going to do that for you because I don't think there's many people from China listening to this one. So let's kind of just pretend. I'll start now. We use the the past perfect to talk about events that happened in the past but affect the present. Look at these. I've eaten too many cakes in the past. Now I feel sick. His car has broken down in the past. Now Finn can't go to the play. I've lost my homework. Now I can't give it to my teacher. We use the present perfect because it's affecting now. If you said, I ate too many cakes, maybe you feel fine now. But if you say, I've eaten too many cakes, then you know it's something that affects the present. What I'd like you to do now, children, is read the story and circle the examples of the present simple, the present perfect that you can see. And that's it for it. Very, very simple. That's all we do to introduce it. I wouldn't go into talking about the form, just a 1-minute explanation of the meaning to help those students know that they've understood it correctly. We then move on to really, really simple noticing activities. I'm going to move through very quickly because I'm running out of time, where we get the students to, as I just talked there, circle examples of that reading that we saw, how to talk about actions in the past using the present perfect. So they sample examples of the present perfect. We then get, this is simply just using whichever example that they're using within the book there. I've just had a question that I'm going to deal with now, just while I remember someone saying, isn't it kind of old-fashioned to use L1 teaching grammar for it. I'd say if you're working face-to-face with the students, then yeah, you probably wouldn't do it. But remember, we're talking about the students learning on their own, and they're primary students. So I think it is important for us to have those moments where we are explaining the meaning to them to help their understanding. Learning independently, if you're 8 years old, is more complicated and more challenging than if you've got the teacher there. So I would say add as much support as you can. So very, very quickly, I'm going to move on to practicing pronunciation. And I've not got too much time to kind of talk about this. So I'm going to simply say, lots of us kind of do drilling with our students when we introduce grammar. And again, I think this is a fantastic one to do, but it can feel a little bit weird for the students. So a great habit to get the students doing is asking for them to record themselves when you are delivering your session to them. So record yourself doing your standard drilling. If you say you were doing to the gym. I went to the gym. Yesterday I went to the gym. You do it like that. Normally if I'm teaching with students, I backchain with them, show them a video of you doing it, and get the students to record it as well. So this, again, I've only got 5 minutes. I'm going to only leave 5 minutes for question, just because I started 5 minutes late for them. Tongue twisters, fantastic ones. Get them recording it there. This is the important part for kind of flipped teaching for the students, is that asynchronous stuff, this setting a context, introducing the language, practicing the language. We get the students to do that on their own, independently with it. And then when we moved to our face-to-face session, we're focusing on getting the students communicating and talking together. So linking to the classroom, when you move to your classroom, it's really important that we give the students a little bit of support. Start off with a quick quiz or a short group task where they work together on the content that you taught them asynchronously. Give your students in the face-to-face class a chance to ask you questions about what they can do, about what they learned independently and asynchronously for it. You can use traffic light systems where they show you a green if they're very confident, they show you a red, means they don't really understand it, and then maybe you want to divide them and teach them in differentiated groups for it. And then the key part of doing all of this for it is making sure that your face-to-face sessions focus on communication-based activities for it. Stage them very, very carefully and make sure you carefully monitor your students on it. So I'm going to kind of just give you a couple of final tips here for the students. Is if you're kind of working on this flipped approach, make sure you explain it to the parents and the carers for it. Make sure they know what to do on this stage. Make sure you've explained it to the students. Now, I don't mean tell them we're doing flipped learning to increase your communication, but tell them we're doing this work online. So when you come to class, you will be doing a recording of it. And mostly important, please make sure you ease the students into it. Don't just jump in with too much. I'm going to kind of read, because I have, and I apologize, I've run over. There's a few questions that I've got that I'd like you to think about. So they've been saying in the chat box that you'll be able to get the PPT. There's a few questions for you to be able to think about there for it. We've got a couple of quick questions. I'm not sure, Simon, if I've got time to answer these questions or if there's something that you'd like to go. But I've got a kind of, yep. Yep, I'll take a couple of questions there for it. Let me quickly scroll so I can kind of see them. What is the optimum video length for a literature video for a 10-year-old? I would aim for each of your videos should never be more. By 10 years old, I'd say 10 minutes is really the maximum for it. You know, if they're younger than that, nearer 6 years old, you're aiming for 5 minutes at the most for it. But as they kind of get to 10 years old, I think you can kind of go for 10 minutes. If you do have more that you want to input there, what I'd say to do is break it down into 10-minute chunks. It's much, much easier to watch 2 10-minute videos than it is to watch one 20-minute video. I've got a question here from Amelia. I think I'm saying your name right. How to make teaching conversation class asynchronously possible for it. It would be possible. You could do something where you're kind of recording, if you use something similar to WhatsApp, asynchronously, in a one-to-one teaching one, where you kind of leave a message or a quick question, and then they kind of answer it, and doing it like that. But the reason I'd be careful about teaching conversation asynchronously, you know, through distance at different times, is it's very, very uncommon to do that in real life. The only time I can think of conversation happening asynchronously is if you were using something like WhatsApp on it, or if you were using something like WeChat here in China. So that's really the only way that I'd kind of do it with the students, asynchronously. Application of the subject in the form for a quick lesson at the end. Because a quick lesson plan. So I think this is a quick lesson plan of showing you what you could do with a flipped learning or asynchronous. The key thing I'd recommend doing for this, and there is examples and there's more detailed explanation in this position paper, this is for Effakan, I think I'm saying your name right, is it would depend a lot depending on what you're teaching. But really, we should be trying to mimic what you normally do in a face-to-face classroom as much as possible, just by breaking down the stages into quick tasks that the students can do. So introduce your context first, have them analyze the form next, then have them think and evaluate the form, and then have them move on to doing something such as applying it. But make sure you have all those stages in your lesson plan, no matter what you're doing. I think that's kind of all the time I've got for it. There's quite, do we have any advice for inexperienced English teachers of young primary learners? Yes, just try and have fun would be my quickest one for it. There's lots to do. I think the nice thing for inexperienced teachers at the moment is you're being thrown into a situation where nearly everyone is inexperienced teaching online to young learners, or doing blended learning with young learners. So that's my main bit of advice if you're new to this, is remember that nearly everyone is. But I do think that's all the time that I've got for it. And I apologise for running a little bit late and kind of rushing through a couple of my last points. But I think I'm going to kind of hand over, and I'll kind of turn off my webcam now.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much, David. We're so grateful to have had you on the session today. And there are a few sessions of ELT Together left. I hope you'll be able to join us then. And as you can see, Kat shared some information about the feedback survey. Please do fill that in, and that helps us to keep all the remaining sessions as relevant to you as possible. So thank you very much, and have a good day or a good night. Bye-bye.